Sean Mahoney. I'm with FHIR, and we're going to do kind of an overview of the National Directory and some of the plans and goals that we have for future Connectathons and how National Directory can participate in future Connectathons as a endpoint provider to different tracks. But before we get into that, I thought we could maybe just do a quick around the table and introduce yourself, the company you're with, and if you know any insight that you know of the National Directory. Are you aware of the National Directory, or is this new to you? So can we start maybe on the side of the table?
This isn't new to me. I work for the Joint Commission, and I'm mostly on the quality measure side, on the data receiving and quality measure side. But I was very interested in how the burden reduction, especially for data submitting and data reporting, how to reduce the burden of the hospital. And this subject it's kind of aligned with what my thinking is, but it's relatively new to me, so I would love to learn it.
My name is Mindana Jack. I'm from Montana. So the current now the National Directory will transition to us. So we come here just to learn and to support for this project.
Mark Scrimshire from Onyx Health. I'm also the lead of the Payer Data Exchange workgroup, so PlanNet actually falls under, traditionally fell under that group. I think I actually named it PlanNet. So yeah. We have implemented a number of provider directories based on PlanNet for clients, and as I'm dealing with Payer Data Exchange, it's really looking at how the National Directory potentially fits into the evolution of Payer Data Exchange.
I'm Balaji. I'm also with Onyx Health, working for Mark, and currently working on the burden reduction track for the EPA. I have implemented the plan and provided directly for the patient access, so I'm aware of what it is.
Okay, Dustin, and also with Onyx Health. This is all pretty new to me. I generally work in ops. Just trying to get a better understanding of how all this works, especially with the PDEX track.
Hey everyone, Michael Cox. I'm with Mark and Dustin here on the PDEX track mainly. I'm joining in the FAST group because we were thinking about, as Sean was just saying in his intro, using the National Directory as a directory for endpoints for multi-uses, especially for this PDEX data exchange flow, the B2B flow. We are, for this testing for PDEX, right, we want to have this authority, not a certificate authority, but essentially a trust framework of certificates that will essentially be like the authority, the end all be all to check these certificates in this MTLS part of the PDEX flow. To make that simple, basically, helping have a repository of certificates that are valid as payer entities, right? So that we can use that to confirm system-to-system interactions for the PDEX flow.
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Ankit Agarwal. I'm also part of Onyx, part of Mark Scrimshire's team, so have been involved with the various HL7 tracks for last few years, and we have been doing some cutting edge work on the directory front, even with BCBS organizations. But of course, we wanted to learn more about this national provider directory and see that how we can integrate it with PDEX and other tracks.
I'm Daniel. I'm from Athena Health. This is relatively new to me. Like I've read through the IG and that type of stuff, but like that's pretty much it. And just trying to get an idea of kind of what's going on in this space.
My name is Rick Lizaveld. I'm with Aegis, and I'm here as a sub on the Lantana project. For this track, I was designated to be the test rep for National Directory and PlanNet. So.
I'm Kate Ryan. I'm also from Aegis, and I'm also sub to Lantana. Just trying to learn as much as I can about this so that it's a smooth transition in the next month or so.
Yeah, I'm Brett Stringham. I'm with Optum. I'm also a co-lead on the fast fire security team. I've worked with Louis Moss in that capacity, so of course I'm interested in the directory part to make sure there's synergy that continues with that. So I'm not only here to pick up what I know about, but to keep up with what's coming next.
My name is Dave Hill, and I'm with Meyer, and I work with the teams to support Vinci, Fast, and Karen for Blue Button, as well as the Basket project.
Justin Shook with Scrimshire, and I've been working on UDAP and offering up a C# reference implementation going forward. Definitely interested in trust frameworks and long history of really direct. So.
Hi, I'm Jason Teeble, Evernorth, interested in the directory and the UDAP.
I'm Vicente Morales, Senior Advisor, also for Evernorth, interested in seeing what's on the national directory.
Tom Loomis, Evernorth, been working on node implementation of UDAP, both client and server, and want to try adding query capabilities to that.
So it sounds like most people are relatively familiar with the National Directory. I can walk through some of the slides, but I wanted it to be a little more interactive. And Mark and I talked a little bit about how PDEX could utilize the National Directory for payer endpoint exchange. Maybe we can kick off by bringing up this diagram. Has anybody not seen this diagram before? So it sounds like most of you are at least conceptually aware of how the National Directory works. But just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So the National Directory is envisioned as in the middle, a single verified national directory where organizations and providers will contribute attested information about themselves, the services they offer, the roles they play across organizations, the affiliations they have between organizations. All of that information is attested to through a registration process into the National Directory. That information is then verified through a verification process utilizing primary sources. And then that information, once is verified, is then distributed into workflow directories through a subscription process, which is at 11 through 14, where workflow directories, depending on their scope of concern, could be a simple endpoint directory exchanging provider endpoints, or similar to a PDEX plan implementation that allows the patients to find providers to meet their healthcare needs. All of those could be different types of workflow directories that then subscribe to the National Directory, pull the verified information into their directories, and allow end users to query for either payer-to-payer exchange, provider-to-provider exchange, patients querying for new providers to meet their healthcare needs, new networks, that kind of query type application. There are 3 implementation guides that support the National Directory. We actually just went through STU ballot. We're moving into reconciliation now. In the blue circles, we have the Exchange Implementation Guide, which describes the interactions between the verified National Directory and distributed workflow directories. IG number 2 is the Endpoint Query Implementation Guide, which really defines many ways that end users would search the distributed workflow directories for endpoints and information of providers and organizations. And then the Attestation and Verification Implementation Guide defines the registration process for organizations and providers to then contribute their attested information and the verification process as well. that at a high level is the National Directory architecture. At today's, at this, where's the slide for it? So we have use cases that Abigail Watson is our developer for a reference implementation. And the use cases that we put together for a reference implementation is a hospital network, St. James, that is operating in the state of Connecticut, opening up a new hospital facility, and they want to use the National Directory to register and validate their facility. So first they check to see if the directory is already registered, so that's a query to a federated directory. Then they would register for an account with the National Directory so that they can contribute their new attested information about the facility. Then St. James actually subscribes to the National Directory for updates to their local directory. They attest as a new organization with the federated directory. That information is then validated through external sources. And then the final scenario is a instance of a federated directory that has a restricted access to it. So women's shelters is the example we're using, where the information about the locations of women's shelters are restricted to social workers. We also, our track also, we have a combined track of National Directory and PlanNet. I'm going to go back to the architecture. In our combined track, in this scenario, we have, in the blue circle number 4, a PlanNet payer provider directory acting as a distributed workflow directory, where a payer would pull the verified provider information from the National Directory and publish that as part of its provider directory on their payer network. So, you know, it's one of the reasons why we combined the National Directory and PlanNet, because we envision both efforts kind of working together to both contribute information and provide information to and collect information about payer directories for end users of private healthcare.
I think it's worth thinking about what this means as we go forward. So at the CMS Connectathon, we've implemented a number of provider directories for payers. And the situation today is typically a provider is having to update their information at each of the plans that they're working with. So from a burden reduction perspective, there's a big opportunity here where we think about compartmentalizing the data. And so what we did is a very simple, really just a client application over here on the right, the Connectathon, is we queried the provider, the National Directory, for a practitioner's information and pulled that down so that we could then update the local copy. So you then move towards a scenario where the provider can be entering their data once. So they have a way of being attested, they can go in, they can keep their data up to date in one place. Then the plan is really thinking about who's in my network and what services may I have contracted with a particular provider for. So you could have an example where a provider may have, 7 or 8 services that they provide, and the plan may contract with them for 2 or 3. And so you want a process where, as part of that maintenance of their provider data, they could actually confirm the submission that the plan has made to say, are you providing those services? And so you bring the data together so the plan can be submitting the information about the network, but they're utilizing the underlying data data about the provider and where they operate and so forth, provided by the provider or the organisation they work for, done once rather than done 20 times.
Right. And one provider could provide services across multiple.
Yes.
payers.
So they could be, you know, I do this for United, I do this for Cigna, I do this for Blue Cross Blue Shield, and they could confirm that basically in one location, rather than having to go to 20 different provider portals.
Isn't that typically on the practitioner role though, not on the
Yes, it
provider
would.
itself?
But
Okay.
exactly that we've already got that sort of separation where it's defining the skills or services that you're providing. So you think about it that I'll go and pull the practitioner record from the national directory, assuming that the practitioner will keep that up to date.
Yeah.
But the practitioner role, or effectively some of the, I think in PlanNet, the network element that also links to facilities, there's the same sort of type of control as to which services are they contracted for.
But then that practitioner role object, is that owned by the payers directory or the national directory?
I think where you'd have it is that the payer originates that, submits it to the national directory, where the individual practitioners, and Dave, keep me honest because you know this stuff better than I, the practitioners could come in and confirm that they do in fact have that relationship for those services with that given network from that plan.
But wouldn't that also involve the relationship of the practitioner to the organization though? And it feels like that should live in the directory, right? Like.
Yeah, but the question is who's originating that? The plan defines who's in their network, right? All this is doing is saying, can the provider go, or the facility administrator go to one place and confirm all of the relationships that they have contracted to perform, right? So it's a validation process.
But what if suppose a provider is dealing with multiple specialties, so each one of them will verify or validate the provider and everything will
Well, the example is if I go to a practitioner, an organisation that does chiropractic and physiotherapy, right? Two completely different things. You could have the scenario where that facility was only contracted with a plan for physiotherapy but not chiropractic. So they would simply confirm those relationships.
Okay.
So I think there's two sides of that, right? There's the relationship with the organization that they're providing the services for, but then there's the network relationship with the payers.
Yeah, that network relationship may be directly from practitioner to the plan's network, but it may also be via the facility that they operate out of is contracted for certain services to a network of payers. So there's all sorts of different views. So you'd have effectively the practitioner can validate for themselves, but then you probably have some sort of administrator for a facility or organisation that confirms the contractual relationships they may have, A, with the practitioners, but B, with the plans.
With networks, yeah. I think when we talked about that internally, I think there was some, I don't want to say resistance about getting that into the national directory, but that's changing all the time. That's very fluid, those contracts and networks, and so I think there's some probably discussion around how that gets synced back from one of the federated copies back up to the national, and what does that attestation validation look like?
If you think about the reality today, under the interoperability rule, if you have a requirement to produce a provider directory, you're already expressing those relationships, and anybody, I think Google is already out there pinging and pulling down data from all of those directories.
And they're public.
And it's public.
Yeah.
Right, so what we're talking about here is having a mechanism where you can place it somewhere.
Right.
You are the authority on one side of that equation, and somebody else can come in to testify that they're confirming that relationship.
Right.
Yeah, so the payer could provide their their provider directory, but then it also allows the providers to then go attest that they actually are part of this.
They're confirming the other side.
Right, so it's a bi-directional validation that.
Yeah, and that's the real value that the verified national directories provide.
So how does that, what does that process look like if, you know, let's say Cigna we have our federated copy, we put the information in there, right? And it pushes back. Like then the validation at the station has to happen before the national directory will broadcast that out to other federated copies, or that basically what it? So we can have it in ours.
Yeah.
As soon as we can confirm our side,
Right.
basically.
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously the contract knows.
You know, and the federated directories can add additional information beyond what is provided by the national directory.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Okay.
But that relationship would not be verified in the national directory until both parties acknowledge that they have this relationship.
Right. So is that part of the subscription that gets pushed back in, or it has to lay in there and then they go in somewhere and then validate the test? What is that?
So that would be part of the verification process. So between organizations and providers that have these relationships, envisioning some kind of interface where maybe a provider will go in and say, the national directory would list, here's the 20 organizations that claim a relationship with you, and here's the services that they say that you're offering. Verify that this information is correct. And then that would be the verification process for those types of relationships. That would then get distributed down to the workflow directors through this subscription process.
So if a provider is associated with 20 different health plans, all the 20 plans have to approve it, and so the provider has to attest it.
Both
basically,
sides
both
need
sides.
need to agree with that relationship.
And then from the provider side, do they have an account with the national directory, or do they do it through like their account with their EHR, or like kind of what does that look like, especially for like a provider who may practice with multiple organizations?
Exactly. I would think that the providers would be interacting directly with the national director through some sort of UI.
So there's a disconnect with their practice management system then? So where they manage their credentials and their demographic information outside of EMR itself, the practice management system. Now you're asking them to manage that information there and in the national directory, so there's no reconciliation.
So they would have to register with the national directory. But the benefit there is that, like Mark mentioned in the scenario where they are participating in, you know, multiple payers, multiple networks, instead of working with each one of those payers separately, they're doing it all in one place in a single national directory.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying though is that each provider organization has their own EPM, right? So provider could be at multiple organizations, so their information could look slightly different through each EPM, right? And you're gonna have, the provider have to be managed through the national directory. And you're telling them, you know, how to attest for each organization. So now you're saying the EPM has their information, and someone has to manually possibly, or update all that information into the national directory. So would it make sense to have some type of hook into the EPM, so you know where all the credentials and demographic at a practitioner level is hooked in? Because you have to consider the practice management suite aspect of it.
I would think they'd be able to do it at the repositional.
You could potentially have a scenario where the provider is basically enabled, for example, the organisation to act on their behalf in recording what those relationships are.
Yeah, I'm just saying, if you had the EPMs involved in these conversations, then you're really capturing that whole kind of life cycle. When they go and update all their credentials and organizations, how the EPMs will go to the national verification and update.
I think that's more 6 and 7 here, that are assigned parties, instead of the provider directly contributing information.
What I'm also interested in here is going beyond the provider pay data exchange is really, you know, like, that's pretty well all the problems we're dealing with here fall into really 4 levels. You've got the data, which we're addressing through the IGs and the particular use cases. You've got an attribution issue, who's able to see what. Again, that's largely we're dealing with at the IP level. You've then got access control, which is things like smart on fire addressing. But the ultimate thing you've got is discoverability, right? And how do you find and how do you trust the connections that you find? So what I'm thinking about is how can we identify effectively a trust group that could have the ability to have entries into the national directory. So, for example, a payer organisation, multiple payer organisations could be connected with a common trust framework that they've all agreed to. That model could easily be extended to payers talking to providers. It could be extended to payers or providers talking to third-party applications ultimately, which is where then UDAP starts to come into what's the layer that we do for then getting the relevant credentials to do whatever it is we want to do. So I'm thinking about, can we sidestep the MTLS discovery piece that we're trying to work out? So can we agree that at least for testing, can we identify somebody, whether it's, you know, one of us that's leading the particular use case, to be the arbiter of who's in the testing group, and then therefore submit organisation and endpoint entries into the national directory that are effectively part of an overall trust framework. So now you potentially have the discoverability and some level of being able to say that's a trusted connection. So at least the testing phase, obviously when we went to production, there would have to be an organisation or some entity that has the role of agreeing who's in the group. But you then you publish the relevant certs and so forth here, so that you can go and discover those endpoints and go to them, and then potentially go into the UDAP process to get the scopes for the particular use case that you've been approved for in that directory endpoint.
So you're talking about like a root CA, a test CA for
Effectively, I think effectively, yeah.
Yeah. So we were just talking about that this morning. That feels to me like I don't know if that belongs in FAST. I think it probably does. But HL7 should probably get involved and help facilitate that. For all the UDAP stuff that I've been involved with, everyone's been using the EMR direct certs, right? And they're starting to, I think they're charging now for that, which that's not a non-starter for us particularly, but maybe, you know, it might be for some folks. But I think UDAP's gonna start coming into play in all these use cases, right? And so there ought to be sort of a HL7 connect-a-thon CA that everybody can use, and we all know that we're.
And I think that's what we're thinking is today, and unfortunately everything, you know, David's not in the room, but we've got Common, which is basically a directory we go to find out who's published what, right? What are you trying to test?
Right.
And I think what we're saying is, should the national directory become that equivalent to Common for connectathons, at least?
Yeah, the RI probably
Right.
should, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if we want to start putting this stuff through the paces, yeah.
Yeah, that's really the goal here, is to set up something so that everybody in that big room back there can be using the national directory.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we don't have all of this software putting in static endpoints. They can be pulling the endpoints from the national directory. And, you know, that just helps build, okay, is this scalable to some degree? Because we've got several hundred people in there, right? And it's not millions or anything like that we're going to eventually see, hopefully. But, you know, we can hopefully identify some issues, performance issues, whatever, and do that. So that's, and I think also it gets people more exposure to UDAP and things like that too, which will help. the adoption of those.
Well, it would also expose basically the attestation and verification process, because
Right.
we'd have to attest that ability to go and register to get your endpoint in for the connector.
Yeah.
Right.
All three IGs probably.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
could set up their own federated
Yeah.
copies, the whole
Right.
query exchange, all of it.
Yeah.
What interactions do you plan to have the National Directory like support? Like, you know, so from like a EHR perspective, it could be like, especially kind of when you start talking about like referral use cases and like that type of thing, it could be useful to have this as a like, hey, I want to find like providers here that accept like this insurance plan or like that type of thing, more essentially than kind of like you know, like kind of pulling in that data and kind of doing that ourselves. So like, since this information is in there, like those type of interactions, they seem like they would definitely be like kind of providing like a global provider directory search and like that type of thing. Or is that not on the radar?
I think we need to take some baby steps first.
Okay.
This first thing, if we can identify a way that you can effectively register to test a use case,
Yeah.
so anybody can find that discovery. I think to your question there, what you're looking at is these use cases are ultimately sort of going to drop into maybe larger specifications. So,
Yeah.
you know, we've currently got US Core, and you know, pick a version that it's on, but the next version is going to add a whole bunch of new stuff, right?
Yeah.
That may be tested separately, but then it's ultimately going to drop into that main spec. So you're going to be looking for, you know, which of the EMRs are on a certified product list. You know, can I find them?
Yeah.
Right? Where's the endpoints to get to them for a given organisation? Right?
So does this replace Lantern then?
No, I don't. I think Lanterns are dealing with a different issue of how compatible is your FHIR APIs, right?
Okay.
This is more, to me, this is more the discoverability. Can I find where to go? You could then use this information to feed Lantern to say, okay, so what are they actually publishing, right?
Okay.
But I mean, you know, however, you know, people are out there exchanging information, but how do you know in the real world where these endpoints are coming from? How do you know how to attach to, you know, the folks that the organizations that you want to communicate with? That's where the National Directory.
Okay.
It's the phone book.
Yeah.
Essentially.
So essentially the National Directory is answering, given an organization or practitioner, where are the places I can find them?
Right.
Okay.
Does the query, number 2, does that cover the types of queries he was talking about, or is that strictly just endpoint queries?
So we, in the query AG, we identify 7 different implementations of a workflow directory. It can be as simple as endpoint directory, or it can provide additional such capabilities for care teams, payer networks, you know, provider roles. Those similar to how Planet payer directory works.
Okay, so that's kind of some of the stuff you were getting.
Yeah.
Providers out of an organization and a network, kind of those types of queries.
Right, and that's why one of the challenges as we work through this is because people have different use cases, what they want to get, what types of information they want to get from this. And so we have to try to account for all of those different things. So, you know, if you just want an endpoint, you can go and you just get an endpoint.
Yeah.
You know, without having to worry about having to support all the other stuff.
Right. So in the work we've done with PDEX, you know, Tom, we're trying to address this MTLS configuration. So I actually took the profiles from National Directory Query to define, to basically work as the basis for the organisation and the endpoint resources that would go into a bundle. So, you know, really what I'm looking at is, can we use this? You just put those entrants into the directory, and I think that's what Michael here has been actually trying to accomplish. If we can get through the attestation piece, we should then just be able to post that resource. And if we can work at how that goes, then anybody else that wants to go and play, they could go and load those resources in there, and you know, we start to build up. Here's the list of testers.
So Mark, the item number 4 on that, is that the normal Planet implementation guide?
I mean, these guys wrote, started with validated healthcare directory that sort of spun off with then till PlanNet was based off the data models in validated healthcare directory, and then both of those then informs the national directory, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So it's all the same.
Same team has done all of this. I mean, Bob Beerley has probably been involved in all 3, and he was involved originally with validated healthcare directory, which is an international standard that's actually currently in production, I think, in Australia.
Yeah.
But that was back in like 2015.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this is focused on the U.S. market, and, you know, PlanNet is focused on the U.S. market, and that's part of the patient access API.
So a lot of the specifications in PlanNet was pulled into the national directory. Certain things like the attestation and the registration, the restriction, are not in PlanNet. But they were in FHIR. So we definitely pulled from previous efforts.
So yesterday when we were talking, we talked about how some of the flow around as you're getting updates, you're going to start having, there's a possibility at least of having disparate information come in. So if I'm a practitioner and I go in and I do my attestation, is it the case that every time something comes in that's conflicting from an organization that I'm with, is there something where if it's been attested to at this point, subsequent notifications that come in or things that don't agree with that attestation are ignored, and they could still, I don't update the model, or is it the case that every time there's an update, there needs to be some type of trigger flow where I, as the person mentioned, or the entity mentioned in this particular attestation or update, that I need to go in and process that?
Yeah, I think any update would have to go through the verification process before it gets distributed out to the workflow directories. As far as conflicting information, I think that's a good example of how different payers might be sending the same provider information, one with address A, one with address B, which one is the correct address. I think that would have to be worked out as part of the verification process for the practitioner to then say this is the correct address.
Related to that question, how do you plan on dealing with, like, I guess, data staleness? Like, the provider attests that, like, hey, I work at this place and, you know, accept these insurances, whatever else. And once they stop doing that, or once they move locations or whatever, they may not update that, right? Like,
I think the situation you're really facing here is what happens today is because you're having to update in 20 different places. I've always argued, you know, unless the checks stop, you don't update the data, right?
Yeah.
So the thing with this is that if you're updating in one place, you're more likely to keep it up to date, right? I think there is a very good question around things like subscriptions that maybe you would want as a provider or as an organisation to set a subscription. Say anytime I'm mentioned, you know, there's new data, trigger me to go check it out.
And I think under regulation that was proposed, under maybe 9123, that buyers had to update information within 30 days.
Yeah.
So there was regulatory considerations.
okay.
Now, again, 9123 was frozen and a lot of water, so it wasn't implemented. But they were looking at that angle as well, to kind of enforce that contract.
Okay.
I mean, it feels like there's gonna have to be some sort of push notification or something.
Yeah.
So that they can, you know, just doesn't sit there unverified for testing or whatever.
how do you make sure that this is the one place that they have to go to update stuff, not one more place that they have to go to update stuff? Like that kind of seems like, potentially a bit of a risk here, I guess.
Yeah, that's why I say the PCM is someone that should be here, is provider groups are gonna kind of farm that out to their front office staff to manage that update, so you have the PCM here. And then you're enforcing when they update the information as a validation driven PCM. And it stays in their workflow.
Yep.
And then it can be passed to the other, PCMs that are, practice management tools that are out there in the system, right?
Yeah.
That are connected to this directory, so they're getting.
I think part of this is sort of the promotion of this whole concept and making people aware of the potential benefits. It's like you've got an export function in PlanNet, right? Payers ought to realise that that's actually a good thing, because rather than Google coming or anybody else coming along and pinging every single endpoint and pulling all that data down in 7 individual calls, you can have an export that gives you the whole thing in one shot, and that can have a performance benefit in terms of the load on your resources. There's all of those sorts of these are benefits. Thinking about what's involved in actually maintaining the information that is important to me. I do it in one place, it goes where it needs to go. Is it just a different way of thinking? Again, when I was working with the Blues, I would have discussions with the network first. Oh, the network's up to date. Yes, if the provider's getting you the information. Like I said, unless if the check stopped, they make sure the data's up to date. Otherwise, they don't care because the checks still keep coming.
And if it's backed by policy and registration, that helps too.
Yeah.
The caveat to make sure the information on the data is where the check is going is going to be
Yeah.
located. It's not the phone number, it's not any other ancillary information that you require as part of your organization structure, right? So it's the minimum to get paid. So you have to make sure they're updating all.
Legal decisions.
No, but you're absolutely right, though. You're not being facetious. They only care about making sure the money lands.
Yeah.
But the phone number could be,
Anything could be wrong.
but
Yeah.
it doesn't
But
matter.
if they change office location and the check arrives at the wrong place.
Exactly, so that's why your point is quite valid, because
Yeah.
you're only gonna update part of it.
But it's communicating to the various parties involved that if this is done right, you have less work to do.
Could you potentially use something like claims clearinghouse data or like that type of thing as well to drive I guess like attestation confirmations, like, hey, notice you're no longer like submitting claims from this location, like is this still a valid address?
This probably doesn't answer your question, but it's an important point that this does not contain patient information, so there is no patient information.
Oh, I'm talking about like an aggregate, right? Like, so like if you just basically like a raw counter, that type of thing, like we've looked at similar for like, just like where our providers actually currently practice it.
I think where your question may be going is that when you have something like this being implemented, there could be a whole host of new services offered by new players to help this, because at the moment it's more, there'll be companies that basically offer to deal with your provider directory at your health plan, right? And many plans go, yeah, deal with it, save me the effort. Now, will there be opportunities for other players with all this data flowing around to be able to say, I can save you some effort because I can track this stuff.
Yeah.
So who knows what those will be.
And you get to the EDI transactions, so you're just introducing another standard into, how to parse out the information. Whether it's coming from a new location, old location, and then you're also kind of managing the historical view of a transaction series. So it probably gets to be a
questions that we raised is whether this becomes something that we could at least test at the connector.
Right.
So I think if we were to do that, I don't know, Michael, how did you get on with getting connected?
Almost there.
Almost
The
there.
UDAP has a cert in the header for the JWT. I'm just trying to figure out how to do that software.
So it seems like there is some steps we need to go through to work out what's the attestation process to get registered. We need that to work smoothly if it's going to work at the connectathon.
Right.
So it suggests that maybe between effectively PlanNet in the PDEX work group and the National Directory, maybe we need to set up or broadcaster will do some sort of virtual testing to test this side of the equation to see that we've got it documented, that we can give people clear instructions on how they can register, and we need to also think about what are all the different permutations we're going to have to deal with at the connectathon. So
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions, was these endpoints, right? If I have my PDEX endpoints living at just the National Directory endpoint, I can see, like, just layman wise, you know, it looks like the MTLS bundle for PDEX. That's probably a PDEX one, but maybe there's a tag. Maybe we added something to the profile.
Maybe what we want to do is look for candidates to maybe put just 2 or 3 of the tracks into the directory for the January connectathon.
Yeah, maybe.
And then we see how that goes.
Yeah.
So I still think we do something before January to work out what's the process of making this work.
Right, so I think if you're needing to put in custom endpoints for your track, that might be a good solution. But the other thing is that the current reference implementation, we have over 7 million entries in that. And so if you're not using customized endpoints, you should be able to use the National Directory to pull those in. Instead of having anything custom or anything statically put into your software. So that would test that, 15 and 16.
So some tracks would register as testers, treatment information. Some tracks would utilize the query aspect to return the pinpoint information.
Right. And if we have any, metal solutions, for example, in the past has done the distributed directory. If we had others that did that, you could potentially use, those and we could test 11 or 14. There are other folks that wanted to do that.
So they did some stuff at the CMS connector?
Correct.
Were they pulling from the central, or did they just?
No, actually, there was information that was being put into the national, to their distributed directory, and then they were connecting through the attestation to put that information into the national directory.
So they were pushing it back up?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
So,
About the PDEX thing, it would be that everyone's certs would have to go in there, right? Because since it's mutual TLS, not just the server entities, but also those tester entities.
That's the tricky part.
Right.
Because it's not UDAP, and the cert's not the header every time, you gotta have them all out there.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, maybe it might be better if they have a different endpoint for
If we
endpoints,
switch to
like a
UDAP.
sub slug.
There's a certain.
I'd throw it in there.
We need to bring paddles to the next meeting.
Yeah.
See if we got paddles.
so I think, so I think the next step, I think Mark is right, have a set, get that so that attestation is going smoothly and try to recruit some tracks to do that. And also to generally, advertise the National Directory for other tracks if they want to use, existing information that's in there.
Yeah, and I think that test CA that he was talking about,
That's-
the national director
that's-
could probably drive that, right?
Yeah.
If she's got Abigail must have something, if she's doing registering, she might be using the EMR direct ones right now, I don't know. That's what most of the UDAP stuff is.
Yeah, that's, I think, what we've been using. So, because, for the July connectathon, the EMR Direct provided the certificates. So I do think we need to have some kind of service.
I mean, maybe if everyone's good with
paying $100, they're probably fine.
I think that's, to me, for testing, if you're just, to me, I think, I don't know, my opinion is that's a detriment.
Yeah.
So that's it's a way, you know, we wanna make this as easy as possible.
Right.
Especially for a testing environment.
Yeah. So then, yeah,
That's
that
my-
already
that's
sounds
my
good.
opinion.
So Michael, were you registering as a client? Is that what you were working on?
See, that's my question, is that it really, everyone is a client, because me as a server, like, if we're treating me as the old payer, right, I have a cert there, but I also have to validate someone's cert coming in, that you are, as the new payer, a legit payer, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't think of it as a, like, I was just like, we all gotta get our endpoints in there, right? But as I'm thinking about it, we probably should have like a slug in the path that's just for PDEX, like /PDEX/endpoint. Just doing a put request there. So that at least maybe we could have a little pool just for these, right? Because maybe it'll get too confusing if we group them all together, right? The fact that we have to have a pool of 2 different entities all together, and then grouping that in with the rest of the endpoints that are in there might get a little crazy, you know? That's my thought. I mean,
National Directory.
yeah. The endpoint for endpoint resources in National Directory, like for organization and practitioner, also for endpoint resources, right? That's the one. And the endpoint resource in the PDEX, like overall, it's a bundle, right? Organization is the organization, and then there's an endpoint resource that is like that's where the cert data is held, and that's the accompaniment to, well, I'm in the organization, and here's my endpoint, and here's the cert you need to use it, right? So that's also kind of tough, because then if we're using the way that I just see the Postman collection set up now, there's an endpoint for organizations and an endpoint for endpoint resources, but you can't put that bundle in there together with them. So then if they get decoupled.
In the directory, you wouldn't put in the bundle, you would put in, you register the organisation,
Right.
and then you register whichever endpoint.
Exactly. No, that's what I'm saying, and then it gets decoupled though. Is that a problem?
No, no, because you can search in the endpoint for a particular organisation.
Right. If it references that
The
endpoint, then it's
reference-
fine,
as long as
right?
the references
Yeah.
are
Okay.
Yeah.
I just
So
thought
when
maybe
you- when you
decoupling
put
it
in the
together.
endpoint, you gotta make sure that the organization.
It has that reference to yeah. Right. That would make sense. Yeah. Okay.
We only put the 2 in the bundle because you need that for context, because we don't have a directory.
Right. Okay. So it's not being in a bundle together is not like a hard.
No,
As long as the
you
references
can
cross.
put both, as long as you've got the reference
sense.
between the 2, you can submit them to the directory
Mhm.
as separate items.
Okay. Web formats.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, the other thing would be to figure out who are those tracks that would want to contest, put a tested things in the store.
Tom, I think we could, when we step up for PDEX, I think it makes sense for what we're trying to do, that we maybe try and do this with National Directory.
Yeah, I'm certainly we want to help. I think, I guess the question is, do we put it in the one with 7 however many million, or is it like a federated copy that only has the payers in it, or how?
So it might be a situation where, you know, I think somebody mentioned tagging.
Yeah.
You know, you tag it as test, you know, or something like that, so you're not getting.
Yeah.
But I mean, burden reduction, maybe, you know, Karen, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a ton if you start going through the list.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, so, like, who are the people that can, you know, that we think can really
Well, you've
put
got
this together?
burden reduction and patient cost transparency are 2 examples where you're trying to enable communication between payers and providers.
Right.
Okay? And
So
they
that's
need
not-
to know that they trust each other.
Right, so those would be.
So those are 2 potentially obvious
Right.
examples where you want to test. So, anything else? Well, thank you, Dave, for signing us up to present this.
Thank you, Mark and Sean for the show.
Thanks everybody for attending.
Yeah, I think hopefully people can see that there's definitely this discoverability piece is a critical thing to solve.